Australia has some of the weakest protections for free speech of any first world country. We don't have the constitutional right to free expression, and it seems like of recent, every other week, there's been a new piece of hate speech legislation passed through one of the various different parliaments in Australia. Most recently, in the state of Queensland, the two pro-Palestine phrases, globalise the intifada and from the river to the sea, have both been banned, meaning that now you can face up to 2 years in prison for uttering either of those phrases in public in the state of Queensland. I was also recently informed by my elected New South Wales State Premier, Chris Minns, that given that Australia is a multicultural society, in order to protect the status, the cultural cohesion of us as multicultural Australia, not only do we not have free speech, but it's actually a good thing and important specifically to protect multicultural Australia. I was quite shocked by this. I'm someone who ideologically supports free speech as a concept in a country like Australia that purports to be an open, liberal democracy. I believe that free speech and a person's freedom to express themselves without government persecution is very important. But I've just been informed by my state premier that I guess as someone who supports that, I'm in direct opposition with multicultural Australia. So I guess I have to choose one or the other. And beyond that, it got me thinking, what do Australians actually think or feel about the concept of free speech? Do they support it, the idea of it? And in practice, is it something that there is the kind of political will to maybe entrench in our law anytime soon? So in order to ascertain how Australians feel about it, I did some research on recent polling from the past 5-6 years. And what I kind of found was really interesting. I found two different types of polls or large surveys that have been conducted on Australians in regards to free speech. The first type are these kind of broad, often conducted by international think tanks and NGOs, these broad kind of nationwide polls that they're really vibes based, more so trying to ascertain as to what Australians think in the abstract about the idea of free speech and how comfortable they feel expressing themselves in public in Australia. The second type of poll that I found was more specific, localized polling done by mostly like media outlets, such as like The Guardian, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age. They do these kind of local polls to try and get the temperature of what people feel specifically in regards to new legislation. Quite often these polls are done either in the lead up to an election or after a certain kind of event. I believe these second types of polls are quite politicized in their nature, but what I did find is that the two different types of polling produced very different results in terms of the responses from Australians as to how they feel about free speech. So I'm just going to go through them and kind of collate this data and try and express what I believe it shows about the prospect of free speech in Australia and how we really feel about it. So first, the first type of poll, as I said, it's more kind of broad. This first one was from 2020 from the Institute of Public Affairs in Australia. And it was just, again, it's a very broad statement. It's like I asked Australians to agree or disagree with the statement, freedom of speech is an important Australian value. And of the respondents, I should say all of the polls I'm going to discuss in this video, either I couldn't find the exact number of respondents or the respondents were listed as between 1,000 and 1,500, as was the case with this one. And for this first poll, 87% agreed, 9% neither agreed nor disagreed, and 4% disagreed with that. So pretty strong support in the abstract for free speech, if that poll is anything to go by. A similar one, this was from a United States-based think tank, the Future Free Speech organization, and this asked a bunch of different questions. So you're seeing there was two different numbers. The top for each question, the top one is from 2024, and the one below it is from 2021. And it asked, is it important that people are able to say what they want without government censorship? So I see that as kind of a proxy for, in the abstract, do you support free speech in Australia? And as you can see from the respondents, 94.99% agreed in 2024 and then 94.17% back in 2021. So I think that shows that free speech, I would tentatively say the idea of it is an Australian value, meaning that most Australians do believe it is important, at least as an idea. As I said, though, that doesn't really show us the full story in terms of Australians and free speech. There were these second types of polls conducted. This one I'm going to show you was conducted by The Guardian, and it was much more recent. What you have to understand about these next polls that I'm going to show you, both of them were conducted in January 2026, so this year, and they were kind of quite specifically framed around combating anti-Semitism because of the December 2025 attack on the Chabad Lubavitch Hanukkah celebration in Bondi. However, I think that these are relevant because they are the most recent polling in regards to hate speech laws and free speech, and they also ask different questions that are really more specifically about the hate speech legislation that was recently proposed in Australian Parliament and actually passed. So what you can see here, the first question posed: do you believe Australia needs stronger laws to ban hate speech on the basis of religion and faith? Of all respondents, 66% responded yes, in the affirmative, that we do need these new or certain new hate speech laws. Is kind of vague, but in general they supported that. And broken down by voting intention of the respondents, the greatest supporters were the centre-right party in Australia, or I would classify broadly as centre-right, the coalition voters, 74% support, followed by Labor, I guess centre-left, or categorized as centre-left, identified that way, 70%. One Nation, which is I would say the furthest right-wing party in mainstream party in terms of Australian politics, they were 69% in favour of it. And to their credit, the Greens, the furthest left-wing mainstream Australian party, were 65% in favour of that. Quite interesting, the level of support amongst One Nation voters, because as far as I'm aware of these four parties, they are the only one that actually runs on a platform of free speech, of trying to at least get a referendum or entrench constitutional a right to free speech in this country. But they supported actually more than the Greens voters, who do not. I don't believe from my research, they don't run on a platform of wanting to entrench free speech in Australian law. However, keep in mind, I think it's important to understand the political climate. These most recent hate speech laws introduced in Queensland specifically target pro-Palestine protesters or people who support that. And given that, I think that shows why the support from the Greens base, who are very much aligned with the pro-Palestine movement, I can see why they would have the least support for hate speech laws right now, because they are the most affected. As I mentioned, the recent polling was really done around the topic of tackling anti-Semitism. Here's a breakdown of all the questions that were asked in regard to that. So toughen hate speech laws had a 70% approval response rate. And if you go down a couple, introduce heavier penalties for those who incite violence against Jewish people, actually only had a 67% approval rate. What I think that shows is kind of a misunderstanding, or the lack of clarity, on what hate speech legislation is already on the books in this country, and what further legislation would potentially impact. Because to me, toughen hate speech laws, it seems like it would be a no-brainer. If you wanted tougher hate speech laws, then that would include inciting violence against Jewish people. But I think it shows that the vagueness and how unclear people are on where they already stand in regards to that, and potentially also the politicized nature of how people kind of respond when they're asked a question such as that. Notably, 48% of respondents approved of holding a royal commission into anti-Semitism, and that has actually gone ahead at a total estimated cost of around 130 million Australian dollars. As I showed, Greens voters were actually the most opposed to new hate speech legislation in the most recent polling. However, this YouGov poll from back in 2022, it was posed to the respondents: sometimes the law should impose restrictions on what you can say in public, and 58% of Greens voters actually supported that. So by far, they were the most in favour, or the most against free speech, really. As you can see, only 34% agreed that the law should never restrict freedom of speech in public. So it is actually completely flipped, where Greens voters back in 2022 were the most, pro-free, or the most anti-free speech, and they have now become the most pro-free speech. A similar kind of a question from the same poll: on balance, political correctness is mostly harmful because it unfairly limits free speech, and only 18% of Greens voters agreed with that. So really not much support for a kind of far left in the context of the furthest left Australian political party, a kind of a far left voter base in favour of free speech. There was no kind of will for that, it would seem, back in 2022, but much more so now. And I think that kind of shows the politicization of it, both sides, the far right party that is supposedly running on free speech is now most open to hate speech laws because it appears that the proposed laws, at least by their estimation, won't affect them as much. So as we've seen from these two different types of polls, while in the abstract, Australians generally seem to support the idea of free speech, when it gets into the nitty-gritty of what should actually specifically be done and support for different proposed hate speech legislation, and when it gets politicized, the kind of will to actually do anything to bring about free speech in this country, it seems to kind of evaporate, or at least the support really seems to, it becomes a political issue more so than a kind of human rights or, something that is principally upheld, or that there's the will to try and get us to do that in this country. So what do I kind of make of this? Well, I think, first of all, there is a kind of misunderstanding of what quote-unquote tougher hate speech laws really means. And specifically, I think it's not understood by the general public what is already on the books in Australia. So under Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act 1975, it is unlawful for a person to do an act otherwise than in private if A, the act is reasonably likely in all the circumstances to offend, insult, or humiliate, or intimidate another person or a group of people, and B, the act is done because of the race, colour, national or ethnic origin of the other person, or of some or all of the people in the group. So that is pretty broad. Before any potential new legislation, was introduced this year, it was already very, very draconian. It's already very strict in terms of what you can get away with saying in Australia. And I do think that most Aussies are not necessarily so aware of that and the implications of that. And as I said, it then becomes kind of a politicized issue when in reality, if you kind of explained what that really means, I think, to the average voter or the average Australian, they would probably, I believe personally, that they would probably say, yeah, that seems to go far enough, if not too far, as we've seen by the first type of polling that shows that the general will for free speech, or belief in the idea of free speech, is already there. I will also say that rushed, controversial legislation, such as the recent Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism bill that Labor got through Parliament, I think that the introduction of bills such as this and the recent one in regards to the pro-Palestine phrases, I think that could potentially actually bode well for free speech in Australia in the long term, because I believe that, really rushed, controversial, unpopular, politically toxic even legislation like that, really divisive legislation, when it starts to get applied selectively and politically, as I believe pretty much all hate speech legislation is destined to do. I don't think it's really even possible in a society like Australia's, a liberal, open society. I don't think it's really possible to even implement it in a fair way, or a way that appears fair to the people who fall foul of it. I think that when that stuff starts to happen and it gets drummed up in the media, then potentially the kind of organic, voter support for free speech could drastically increase. I think the bottom line is that Australians seem to kind of misunderstand free speech, even if they say they agree with it, or then support things that go against it. And I think ultimately, when Australians, as shown by the difference between the One Nation voters and the Greens voters being basically swapping places or thereabouts in terms of their support for quote unquote hate speech laws, I think that when Australians are asked whether they support hate speech laws, I think that they are more kind of responding to in a kind of self-interested way. Do I support hate speech laws for myself or my political enemy? And that's what I mean by these kind of polls getting quite politicized, especially given the current political climate in Australia. And I think that anyone who kind of advocates for free speech should be quite aware of that. And I think that the goal should be creating the climate where you do have enough of a kind of groundswell of support for a voter base to see it in their own self-interest to introduce free speech or some kind of Bill of Rights, constitutional. I know that technically might not be the correct way to describe it, but enshrining it in Australian law, and then once you have it in, defending it like a kind of beachhead, as it is done in the United States.